Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this webinar held by the Centre for Global Development and the International Rescue Committee. My name is Helen Dempster, and I am a Policy Fellow and Deputy Director of CGD's Migration, Displacement and Humanitarian Policy Programme. As all of you here know, humanitarian and development crises are increasingly protracted and complex, lacking clear solutions and paths to reach the most affected individuals and communities. One way to navigate this uncertainty is through adaptive management, a learning-oriented project management approach that helps implementers and donors understand what is and is not working, adapting program design or delivery based on this new information. This approach is being used by a 5-year program, Refugees in East Africa, Boosting Urban Innovations for Livelihoods, or REBUILD. It is aiming to achieve economic self-reliance for urban refugees and host communities in Kampala, Uganda, and Nairobi, Kenya. The evidence for how best to support refugee economic self-reliance is limited, and even less is known about what is effective for urban refugees specifically, hence why using adaptive management principles is helpful. But working in this way requires implementers and donors to think and act very differently from other projects, something which is extremely difficult to do. This webinar will hopefully illuminate some of the benefits and constraints to working in an adaptive way and help others who may want to live out these principles in their own programs. So firstly, today you will hear from Nicole Herbert, Deputy Country Director for Programs and IRC's Global Surge team. She is one of the co-authors of a new study, which we released a few months ago. She's going to present lessons learned in that paper. It looks at the first 2 years of Rebuild's attempt to live out adaptive management principles. In doing so, I'm sure she will provide all of you with a really good overview to the topic and set up our panel discussion today. So secondly, we're going to open to our panel. We have a really fantastic set of people joining us today from a range of organizations at the forefront of humanitarian and development crises. Each panelist is going to have 2 questions to respond to, getting their views on why adaptive management approaches are important and what needs to shift for those approaches to be even more useful. And thirdly, we're going to open up to Q&A to hear from all of you. So you can ask your questions at any time by writing them in the chat. You should see the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will collate them throughout the discussion and ask them to the panelists at the end of the panel discussion. So I'd like to thank you for being here. I really appreciate you joining, and I'm looking forward to Nicole for her remarks. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Helen, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So just bear with me while I load our slides. There we go. So as Helen mentioned, I'm just going to give a quick overview of some of the highlights from the paper. So just starting with an overview of the Rebuild program, also touching on the approach that Rebuild used to support adaptive management, some of the highlights of what we've been learning in the first 2 years of the program, and then just closing with an overview of the recommendations from the paper. So the Rebuild program, as Helen mentioned, is a 5-year program. It's funded by the IKEA Foundation with IRC as the lead partner. It's being implemented in 2 cities in East Africa, Nairobi and Kampala. And the program goal is to achieve economic self-reliance for 20,000 urban refugees and other host residents. So Rebuild is implementing a variety of interventions at both the individual and community level. So at the individual level, these are primarily livelihoods interventions, including employment and micro-entrepreneurship. And at the community level, the program is supporting local markets and social cohesion. There were three key reasons that Rebuild decided to adopt an adaptive programming approach, all of which were really related to managing uncertainty. So the first was the evidence for what works to achieve economic self-reliance for refugees in developing country contexts is mixed at best, and it's even more limited for urban refugees specifically. Secondly, the economic self-reliance is influenced by a whole host of systems with complex interdependencies. So even as the evidence base expands and more is known about what works, a degree of uncertainty will still remain. And lastly, the rebuild design phase really coincided with the onset of the COVID crisis. So it was very difficult to anticipate what the context would look like and what would be operationally feasible to implement in the midst of a global pandemic. So in terms of the approach to adaptive management, to put this into practice, we adopted three core strategies during the design phase. So the first was to develop hypotheses of what may work, drawing on an evidence review and comprehensive stakeholder consultation. So we didn't build out a detailed program design. Instead, we had an initial set of interventions, some well-established, some more novel, that we could then intentionally iterate on throughout the 5-year program life cycle. Secondly, we built out comprehensive channels for generating evidence and learning to ensure that we would have the right information at the right time to test these hypotheses and to decide what was working or what needed to be changed. Importantly, those evidence channels were tailored to the level of certainty that we had in each of the interventions being delivered. And then lastly, we developed very clear frameworks for governance and decision making. Because we knew that the program would be constantly evolving, it was important that we had clear pathways mapped out to make those decisions about adapting based on new information coming in. A cornerstone of this approach is the use of strategy testing events. So that's where the team comes together and proactively reflects on what is and is not working in the program and makes decisions about adaptations. So what we've been learning in the first 2 years. So the paper highlights a few different learnings that were drawn out of the first 2 years of the program. The first being that adaptive management really requires implementers to plan in a very different way. So we put much less priority on building out detailed activity plans for the full 5 years of the program, knowing that they were going to change. And instead, we spent far more time sort of designing the process for how adaptation decisions would be made in future years. Another learning that was very clear in the first 2 years is that adaptive management approaches can really have lots of benefits in terms of de-risking creativity and innovation. So in linear programming, implementing teams are generally locked into delivering the program as it's described in the proposal and the log frame. And as a result, there's often a disincentive for implementers to pursue solutions that might be more novel because there's the risk that the results that are expected by the donor won't be delivered. In contrast, adaptive management really provides a safety net of sorts because of the flexibility to course correct if things aren't working. That was really something that we saw in the initial planning for the program, where there was much more comfort in considering solutions that potentially, may not have had as much evidence behind them, but were promising. Another learning was just sort of the challenge of managing an adaptive program while also having focus on achieving targets. So what we found in the first 2 years was, Rebuild had a very ambitious target to reach 20,000 people through direct service delivery. However, this was sometimes, created tensions or competing incentives with our adaptive management approach. So the team could find themselves having to make choices about whether they stay the course and achieve the targets, or whether they respond to the new information coming in, change the approach, but potentially not meet targets. And then the last learning was really just the benefit of tailoring learning methodologies in an adaptive program. So Rebuild, I think, is fairly unique in that it really brings in a wide diversity of evidence and learning channels in an adaptive program. So that includes, evidence and learning methodologies that may seem more rigid and maybe not aligned with adaptive programming. So it includes RCTs alongside, more flexible learning methods like pilots. So really this was about tailoring those methodologies to the intervention that was being tested. So finding that right balance of timely information to test novel solutions, but also building in sort of more rigorous evidence generation for solutions that maybe were more established. In the first 2 years, we also drew out a lot of learnings about the enablers and constraints of adaptive programming that are outlined in the paper. So I would say that, IKEA Foundation's sort of really positive example in terms of donor policies supporting adaptive programming was a really key enabler for Rebuild. So, IKEA Foundation really recognized at the outset that the problem was characterized by a lot of uncertainty and set an expectation that there would be change and learning throughout the program. And then closely linked to that, the importance of multi-year and flexible funding can't be sort of overstated. Trial and error to solve complex challenges like this takes time. So IKEA Foundation has committed not only to a 5-year project life cycle and funding, but also a 6-month planning grant ahead of that, so that we were able to kind of develop those adaptive management approaches that I outlined earlier. We also learned a lot about internal policies. So, in the same way that donor policies are really influential, implementers' own internal policies are also really, really key and often don't get spoken about quite as much. So, we found a lot of success in having adaptive policies on the program side, but one of the key learnings was that, there can be a mismatch with operational policies. So building in flexibility, not only on the programming side, but also, operational policies related to finance and procurement, which can tend to be more standardized and more sort of aligned with linear programming as the norm. So sort of addressing that was definitely a key learning and a key enabler. Leadership support also was a really key enabler. So having program leadership that was very vocally supportive of adaptive approaches, that welcomed learnings and supported change when it was proposed. Participatory and decentralized decision making. So, providing forums like the strategy testing events where, a wide range of team members have an opportunity to share learnings and ideas increases the opportunity to find the most effective solutions. That said, I think, there can be some constraints in finding, ways to give voice to more junior staff or frontline staff who may not have as many opportunities to share their learnings, but often have really key insights by virtue of seeing the program implemented on a day-to-day basis. So that was something that the program identified after 2 years and is working on in future years. And then lastly, access to and use of data was both an enabler and a constraint. So the program has really rich data, and that's been really valuable in supporting learning. That said, it's often been quite difficult to synthesize that in ways that support informed and timely decision making. So I think, to some extent, it's easy to underestimate how much time needs to be allocated to really synthesizing data, not just collecting and analyzing it, but synthesizing it in ways that actually are useful for decision making. And again, that's something that the program is really kind of has taken on and is working on in future years of implementation. So just to conclude, just quickly outline the some of the concrete recommendations that the paper closed with. So we've divided this into recommendations for implementers and also just a few recommendations as well for donors to consider. So based on our learning, we would definitely recommend socializing adaptive management approaches and expectations with both programs and operations functions early on. So not forgetting to sort of bring both sides of the implementation into that socialization of adaptation. Also establishing a predictable schedule of reflection and adaptation moments that is aligned with the operational planning cycle. Our experience showed that really was much more impactful in terms of putting adaptation ideas into practice. And linked to that, building in flexible budgets. So it's often difficult to find the budget to actually be able to implement adaptation. So what we did find was having that flexibility, even having contingency funds or unearmarked funds was really key. Having a focus on defining frameworks to make decisions upfront, as opposed to sort of getting in the weeds of building out detailed project design. Treating theories of change as an aid to guide thinking and to test hypotheses. So we didn't do away with theories of change or log frames, but we did change our mindset about how we used them. So they were a way for us to test our assumptions and the design. They weren't sort of a rigid roadmap that we held ourselves to. Investing in data use and learning capacity, as I mentioned before, I think, really kind of make in an adaptive program like this, it's very important that that's built into the program team structure. So having someone who can facilitate conversations about the data and sort of ask probing questions about how it might impact design. And also just kind of the work around synthesizing a lot of data to actually pull out themes and patterns so that decisions can be made based on it. And lastly, for implementers, incentivizing learning. So this really links to our point about the sort of competing incentives in terms of adaptation and achieving targets. So it's important that there are incentives not only to achieve deliverables, but also to learn, and that those are equally valued. And then just lastly, for donors, I think anticipating adaptation in grant structures would be very helpful. So that was, one of the benefits that we've had in this program is, as I mentioned earlier, IKEA Foundation anticipated that changes would be made from the start. And so it wasn't seen as sort of an ad hoc, sort of unusual event. It was expected, and the grant structures already had that built in. Multi-year and flexible funding is really key to be able to do this type of iterative design, and also really key for identifying solutions to complex challenges. And lastly, I think in the same way that implementers need to value learnings, it's also really key that donors do as well. So, not only valuing, deliverables, but also, including in grant agreements, outcomes that are related to learning. So with that, I'm going to hand back to Helen and the panel for discussion, but thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Nicole, for your presentation and for setting the scene for our discussion today. I'd now like to introduce our panel members. As I said before, we've got a really fantastic set of people, so I'm really looking forward to their presentations. So firstly, we have Alice Obrecht, who is the Head of Research and Impact at LNAP. Secondly, we have Priscilla Dembathembe, who is the Program Director for our Rebuild program. Thirdly, William Barron, who's the Chief of Party for the Reaper North project run by Mercy Corps. And last but definitely not least, Mathieu Dimon, the Country Director for Christian Aid in Sierra Leone. So thank you very much to you all for joining us today. I'd like to start by asking you all question number one, which is to provide a bit of an overview of your experience with adaptive management approaches in humanitarian and development programming and why you think they're important. So I'd like to start with you, Alice. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Helen. And thanks for the invite to the discussion today, and congratulations on a really interesting and useful paper. So I kind of want to start by taking a quick step back on where adaptive management kind of comes into the aid sector as a whole, just to briefly remind ourselves. And that comes up, I think, in terms of thinking about why it's so important for the humanitarian sector today. So as Nicole, I think, helpfully outlined, adaptive management and programming, there's different ways that people want to define it, but essentially it's a solution or an answer to the problems that come up when you try to bring linear thinking and linear management and top-down planning approaches into the complexity of the real world. And so it's important to remind ourselves that actually this comes from a much broader organizational culture from the 20th century concept of the corporation that was very dominant in that century. It was dominant across the business sector, in the military, in government, and in the charity sector. And so really what you see at the start of the 2000s of the 21st century is this massive shift to more complexity sensitive, complexity aware approaches writ large. And that's where these ideas start to come into the aid sector as well. First, the development side of the house in around 2008, 2009 with the work that was piloted by the World Bank and others, and then slowly coming more into the humanitarian sector. And I'll come back to why that's important. That brief history is important to remember when we think about why adaptive management is important today. So just in terms of what ALNAP has done in our experience with it, we had done a major research project around 2015-16 on innovation in the humanitarian sector. And what struck us about a lot of those interviews that we were doing with people who were leading humanitarian innovation projects is that a lot of them would tell us about this really iterative, flexible, learning-centered approach that they were taking to their innovation project. And the question would come up, why isn't this what we're doing across all of our programs? Why has this been sectioned off just for programs and projects that are funded as innovation projects? So we followed that up with a wider piece looking at adaptive management and adaptive programming to see how this approach could be embedded more commonly across humanitarian programs and operations. And I have to say, it was a bit of a challenge doing this back in 2017. There weren't a whole lot of organizations that were doing it. IRC and Mercy Corps were a couple of the very few exceptions to that, where we could find examples of people really thinking about and using these concepts and these approaches. And I think it's also helpful, though, to understand why the research was challenging at the beginning and why that makes it a continuing challenge as organizations like IRC continue to engage in adaptive programming in humanitarian settings and humanitarian action. And one of the challenges there is that actually, compared to the development sector and also globally, the humanitarian sector has a reputation for being extremely flexible. And there's a lot of people, I think, especially in the logistics and supply chain side of things in the humanitarian sector, who equate flexibility with adaptiveness when they're actually quite separate things. So you need flexible systems, as Nicole was clearly highlighting, flexible funding, flexible program approaches, flexible M&E. You need all of that flexibility to do adaptive programming, but you can also use flexibility to do other things. And what the humanitarian system and the humanitarian sector has been set up to do is to be hugely flexible around a particular purpose, which is to reach any population in the world in a very short period of time with the same basic goods and services. So in order to do that, to achieve that geographic flexibility, you need a particular type of set of systems that are really agile to achieve geographic flexibility. But those are quite different from the types of systems you need in order to change the services that you offer. In other words, in order to be adaptive and customizable to what communities and what populations that you're serving want in a particular context. And so to shift from a culture and a set of ways of working that gives you high geographic flexibility, but keeps the services the same, to a different model where you're being adaptive and changing what you offer and changing your understanding of the problem and the solution as you go. It's a very different type of system. And sometimes we get a bit in the crosshairs on the language. So I just want to give 3 quick points then on what we saw in our research and what we continue to see in LNAP, most recently in our State of the Humanitarian System report, as being three really top line reasons why adaptive management is fundamentally important for the humanitarian sector today and moving forward. And the first area of importance is that I think increasingly for those of us who are working around and thinking about the issues around accountability to affected populations, adaptive management and adaptive programming is the final missing puzzle piece in terms of getting super responsive, community-driven approaches to humanitarian action. You mentioned that in the development sector, it's more common to talk about the uncertainty of program effectiveness as being the motivation for doing adaptive management, that we don't really know what the most effective approach is. I think that narrative has had less resonance in the humanitarian sector, to be honest, because there's more of a narrative around we know how to save lives, we know what the effectiveness is of our basic interventions. And you can debate whether or not that's true based on the evidence, but that's definitely more of the narrative. So where adaptive management becomes really important then is accepting that, yes, you might know that technically your intervention works. Once you embed it in a complex social context and you're delivering it with real people and to real communities, you need to keep that intervention open to changing over time in order to maintain its relevance to them and to ensure their voice in that service. So essentially, if you're not being adaptive, you're not being accountable to affected people. And that's a clear area of value and importance for adaptive management for humanitarians. A second area of importance related to the very ethos of the rebuild program is that we're seeing increasingly protracted crises that are comprising the humanitarian caseload. 70% of the cost of humanitarian response from 2011 to 2021 came from crises that had been in crisis for over a decade. So it's a huge drawdown on humanitarian resource and is pointing to a need to work differently to make better use of that resource. And it also goes right back to this point of responsiveness to communities, because the evidence that we gather and that others gather in the sector shows that as people are affected by crisis over longer periods of time, they become increasingly dissatisfied with the relevance and the effectiveness of the support that humanitarian agencies are offering them, with refugees in particular having some of the lowest satisfaction scores with the relevance of humanitarian support they receive from these traditional programs. And finally, a third area of importance is that if done right, and that's a big if, hopefully a rise in adaptive management in the humanitarian agenda will support the push towards more locally led response. So one of my most humbling experiences as a researcher was when I was asked to do a training for one of LNAP's member organizations, that's a Filipino national NGO, on adaptive management. And I went to go to do this training and asked about examples in the room of working with some of the concepts and practices of adaptive management. And the examples that they gave of working with communities, I mean, they were amazing. They were prime examples of what adaptive management and programming should be. And I would add, none of that was funded through a traditional bilateral humanitarian donor. So we have to be aware that, as I mentioned at the top, linear programming was the DNA for many agencies based in the global north and for international agencies. It's embedded in that culture, but perhaps adaptive programming is already in the DNA of local organizations. And therefore, the quickest way to get to more adaptive and responsive programming is to make sure we're getting more flexibility and decision-making power to those local actors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alice. Over to you, Priscilla.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can see me. I am Priscilla Dembetembe. I am the program director for the Rebuild program. So thank you so much, Helen and Nicole, for putting the paper together. And Nicole, thanks, kudos to you for a great presentation. From our experience in implementing adaptive programming under the Rebuild program, we have learned that it is critical to developing a learning agenda and learning really to build the body of evidence that will better equip the sector that is providing humanitarian assistance to refugees, and in our case, providing support to build economic self-reliance for refugees in Nairobi and in Kampala. The adaptive programming practices that we have been implementing under the Rebuild team have equipped the team to be able to be agile, to be responsive to the needs and the voices of what the clients are actually saying. So at the core, we pride ourselves of being client-centric, really being robust in client responsiveness mechanisms that will allow us to adapt our program to respond to what the clients are actually saying. In the same vein as Alice had said, really also trying to build the capacity of local organizations. And in our case, we are trying to see what systems, what approaches can help us to decentralize decision-making to refugee-led organizations. We believe that refugee-led organizations really are a true reflection of the needs and the support that refugees require. So if we are able to build their capacity to deliver solutions, livelihood solutions for equipping urban refugees to be self-reliant, will actually have grown a long mile in giving solutions to the refugee crisis that is pertaining in East Africa. In the Rebuild program, we value the relationship that we have with the IKEA Foundation. The flexibility in funding that Nicole alluded to has been critical to helping us to pivot and to adapt, informed by the learnings that come from the work that we're doing, learnings that come from the robust data collection and evidence that is being generated by the program. As Nicole highlighted in the paper, it is a challenge sometimes for the team to make sense of all the evidence that is being collected, the data that is being collected, a wealth of information, trying to make it to make sense, and then helping that information to inform decisions to adapt the program. For us at the Rebuild program, we are being used as a case study by the IRC family in terms of improving IRC programming globally and regionally. We are using the practices from Rebuild and the lessons from Rebuild to inform other programs, whether they are in economic recovery, whether they're in health, to see what can be borrowed from the Rebuild program. We pride ourselves as being a test, that incubation hub for different ways of doing business, an opportunity for innovation, and really being able to put the organization to task. We value the kind of support we get from leadership, and that was one of the things that was highlighted in the paper, that having an enabling leadership support is critical to adaptive management. Granted, you can have a supportive leadership, but sometimes we need to invest more in the human capital, the team that is implementing these practices that we're talking about, having the confidence, giving them the ability to say, this is working or this is not, and knowing that the leader is actually listening. This is critical for adaptive programming. And then lastly, really investing in the M&E infrastructure and capacity. The robustness of the data, the robustness of the evidence that is generated can only better equip the adaptations that need to be made. As much as we have said, we have a very willing and flexible donor in the IKEA Foundation. We need to go to the foundation in the conversations we have with them when we are making a case for adaptation, whether it's dropping a particular activity or an intervention, or it's a request for us to iterate or to pivot. We really need to have figures, data, evidence that will inform the decision and ultimately better equip the IKEA Foundation to be able to make decisions or allow us to make that particular pivot. Thanks. Back to you, Helen.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Priscilla. Now over to you, William.
Great, thank you, Helen. Everyone, hi, I'm William. I am the Chief of Party for the REPA program here in Ethiopia. So this is a 5-year, $40 million USAID funded program through Feed the Future, and we work in the arid and semi-arid lowlands of Ethiopia, trying to build the resilience of households and systems. And so this is the successor to the PRIME program, which is referred to in the Rebuild paper. A bit of background, so REPA is multi-sectoral. We have 4 components: disaster risk management, youth employment, agriculture systems, in particular livestock, and then nutrition services. And through all of these sectors, we apply a system strengthening approach, working with the private sector, governments, and community-based organizations. For us, it's really a no-brainer that we have to build these strong adaptive management systems in REPA. And in that sense, we're kind of lucky for a couple of reasons. Firstly, is because of this system strengthening approach. Everything we do in REPA is through partners. We currently have more than 2,500 businesses and other types of institutional partners. And that means that we don't have direct control over the services and support to our target populations. And we never know for sure whether this planned approach, system change, is going to be successful, and also is it going to be sustainable. And so because of that, we need to constantly monitor, analyze data about the institutional performance in order to change our approaches where we see kind of failure or success, and in particular to scale up successes. And then the second huge driver for us is that we work in this extremely fragile context with multiple extreme crises, especially in the past few years. So, just recently, since I've been in Ethiopia, the last few years, we've had, the worst drought in 40 years in the region. We've desert locusts. We've had, unprecedented insecurity due to conflict, and then COVID-19 as well. And so these shocks required these numerous pivots from our side, from this development resilience programming towards humanitarian programming. In terms of, adaptive management of REPA, we've learned a lot from what worked and didn't work in terms of adaptive management under PRIME. And we find we're just continuing to refine our systems under REPA. And by the way, I really appreciated the kind of simple but effective framework in the paper that was just presented in terms of simplifying but showing very clearly those stages. I think we're kind of doing that without making it as kind of articulated. And so, also many of these approaches that were presented in the paper are also things we're at least trying to do, and I won't talk about those, but I just want to highlight 2 things that I think are kind of relevant to our context. So firstly is that a key learning and a driver of adaptation for us has been about how the private sector systems that we're trying to build are also very vulnerable to shocks and can easily break down. And just one example was the predecessor PRIME did a lot of work on building trading networks of live animals from our lowland target areas to central markets quite successfully. But at the start of REPA, we found that many of those had broken down, mainly due to conflict interrupting supply chains. So now, based on that learning, now how we design our strengthened systems is constantly evolving as we learn about how these systems react in the face of these different shocks and the risks that they face. And a big piece of this is also about building the capacity of the private sector to themselves manage their businesses adaptively. So businesses basically practicing adaptive management for their business, especially around DRM training for the private sector and helping them think through how can they have business continuity in the face of shocks, but also how can they respond and support their customers better in the face of shocks. And then the other thing I'll highlight as well is we've used these crisis modifiers to not only meet these immediate needs in the face of these crises, but also to transform markets and build back better. So one example of that is working with financial institution partners to introduce and pilot these new digital micro loans for farmers to access credit for inputs for things like animal health services, animal feed, and also seeds, as a way to maintain assets, during the crisis, and also recover when the crisis is nearing an end or over. So in this sense, we use this humanitarian pivot not only to meet immediate needs, but also to adapt and experiment around our main resilience approaches. Thanks. I'll stop there, Helen.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, William. And as I mentioned, last but not least, over to you, Matthias.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for sharing this really useful learning that's emerging from the work that you're doing in the Rebuild project. very happy to learn from this, but to also share our experience from Christian Aid with the adaptive approach to management. We've used the approach in some of our key programs, like over the last 6 years now. And so I will just generally speak to the way we've approached this, and then give a short example, practical example of how it has actually worked. We adopted the approach with our partners because we learned through engagements with our Irish Christian Aid Ireland colleagues, as we're kind of trying to look at ways of being able to respond to changes that happen in the context whilst we're delivering projects. And on the Promoting Accountability and Citizens Engagement Project, which is funded by Irish Aid, we decided that, and Irish Aid agreed that we can use that approach to kind of then experiment with the approach in 2017. And we then realized that it accorded us the space to improve the results that we are seeing from the project year on year, because we're able to reflect, to learn, and to adapt, and in the midst of the uncertainty and the complexity of the context in which we work. The approach, because it recognizes that, like you've noted, optimal strategies for achieving impact cannot always be known in advance. Kind of then was able to provide us and our implementing partners with the freedom to iteratively improve strategies throughout the programming cycle. In some cases, this has come through intentionally reflecting upon how to improve programming strategies year on year, where we are actually hosting like an annual strategy testing session, and reviewing the whole theory of change of the project. In other cases, it has come from flexible adjustments to program delivery, like when COVID struck, in the midst of the project. We've also used the approach to kind of really drive in some innovative programming methodologies that allowed us to regularly monitor, review the data that was coming in, to assess the impact and to reflect on what is and what was not working well, and the space to engage with the project participants as to what improvements could be made based upon the learning from the project. We've used the approach to enable us then respond to changes or disruptions that were happening in the context through a really kind of structured process of ongoing listening to communities, what we call community voices, and monitoring the context, harvesting outcome as they are occurring in the field, and then doing strategy testing based on the outcomes that have been harvested. I give you a quick example to just run this up. Several iterations of strategy testing in Connaught district in a chiefdom called Ley, where we have a long-standing conflict between cattle rearers and crop farmers, led to an improved set of measures for mitigating the conflict between the cattle rearers and the crop farmers. You know, we kind of really directly engaged the crop farmers and the cattle rearers to reflect on the failure of the traditional conflict resolution methods that, you know, have been implemented and led by the paramount chiefs and the district council in the chiefdom, and, you know, which has failed to stem the violence, and working with the, you know, parties themselves to the conflict to think outside of the box, you know, beyond traditional means of resolving conflict, and coming together to set up a committee that will really work to kind of dig things out and find a solution. And so they established what they call a cattle settlement committee, which proposed their own conflict resolution strategies, which included enacting a local bylaw, you know, kind of really agreed by themselves to regulate land use in a way that would prevent conflict. And these strategies have led to a reduction in conflict, peaceful cohabitation between the groups, and it's contributed to scaling up of initiatives into a district-wide bylaw that's now been adopted by the district council itself for the other chiefdoms, and it's increased the amount of cultivated land and harvest, but also the space and the freedom for the cattle rearers to kind of then rear their animals as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mattia. That was a really rich presentation. We have one more question left before we open up to Q&A. So thank you very much to Nicole for answering some of the questions so far. But if you have additional questions, we can put them to the panel after this question. Back to my panel now. So my second question is around enablers and constraints. So Nicole talked about many of those in her own presentation. How do you feel like the enabling environment really needs to shift, adapt, change for these types of programs to have the meaningful impact that they are supposed to have? So this time I'm going to go to Priscilla first.
Thanks a lot, Helen. For us, I think the first one is really around the organizational culture. For big INGOs like ourselves, it is important that we carry all of us, practitioners, development practitioners, implementers, programs team, the supply chain, the ops team, the finance, all of us along the journey, all of us, and having the same understanding. Sometimes I feel that it is easy to talk about adaptive programming, adaptive management. It is difficult to implement, right? It's a practice that requires multitasking. It requires the ability to have a lot of coordination. It is an approach that really allows for flexibility in terms of thinking, in terms of systems. And colleagues with the IRC family have said, oh, it's a bit chaotic the way the rebuild team functions. There's chaos, there's order in that chaos, because that is how you do adaptive programming. So there's definitely need to change the way we approach this. It's not just programs team, but it's all of us. It's a new approach. It will take time. It also takes time in terms of a mind shift in really saying, as we are implementing, for us to make the adaptations, we need to be anchored in evidence. How do we generate that evidence? How do we use the evidence that we have to inform decision-making, real decision-making that can have the expected outcomes that the program seeks to deliver. It's also a culture shift, I think, organizationally, to say, let us listen to the frontliners, the actual team, the foot soldiers, the team that is in direct contact with the clients that we are serving, letting them tell us what is working and what is not, and being able to accept their suggestions in terms of pivots that we need to make. I think one of the things that we do under Rebuild, which I also think could help, would be what we call the program learning conference, or as is said in the paper, the program strategy meeting, where we really take time to pause, reflect, and course correct course correction is important. We have the theory of change. Let's take that as a guide. It's not the Bible. It's not so static. It's a guide, and it should be able to be adapted, changed, amended, informed by the evidence that is actually being generated as we implement the program. Another one that I would like to maybe talk about lastly is around the donor policies. In the paper, we talk about the flexibility, the willingness from our funding partner, the IKEA Foundation, to walk the journey with us, being a thought partner, being an enabler really to learning, an enabler to adaptiveness, right? And I think for us, we have been lucky in terms of any adaptations that we propose to the IKEA Foundation informed by evidence. Their systems have been flexible enough, agile enough to allow us and to get approval for iterations, maybe pivots that we actually make, and that will still help us to realize the expected outcome. Yeah, so thanks. Back to you, Helen.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Priscilla. And there are some excellent questions about Rebuild in the chat, so I'm sure we'll hear from you very shortly. William, over to you.
Great, thanks. So for me, the enablers and constraints, as I said before in the paper, really resonated. There's a lot I'd like to say about quite a lot of them. I'll just pick a few. I would also like to highlight the enabler that is donor policies. We're also very lucky to we have 100% budget flexibility with Feed the Future, across all categories, personnel, contractual, etc. We're also able to bring in new interventions and approaches without any kind of approval from USAID. And we also have this dedicated crisis modifier that enables us to make these humanitarian pivots. So I think the donor flexibility and donor policies, that's the foundation. It's like it's a necessary but not a sufficient condition. The others I'd like to highlight, I really appreciated the honesty in the paper about internal systems within the organization and how they can hamper adaptive management. In solidarity, I'd say this is also the case for Mercy Corps. Even though Mercy Corps is quite well known for our MSD programming, as REPA we face these very significant challenges on the Mercy Corps internal systems that allow us, especially in terms of how we partner effectively with the private sector, and in particular, how we adapt those partnerships with the private sector. It seems like a small thing, but it cross-cuts so much of what we do. And so I think, I'm not really sure what the solution is, whether each organization has to kind of bang the drum and create change over time, or whether there should be some kind of collaboration, coordination across organizations to find those solutions, but that's still a headache for us. The thing around the access to and use of data, and what was highlighted in the presentation around, synthesizing the volume of information. For us, it's exactly the same. We collect data every quarter from every one of those 2,500 businesses and institutional partners on their performance. And basically, we found it to be an impossible challenge of processing and analyzing that and getting it into the hands of field team members on a timely basis, so they can understand what's working and what's not and adapt. But what I'd like to share is, what we've seen is a recent shift in the enabling environment and also Mercy Corps systems that's helped us here. So because of this new suite of tools from Microsoft, we've been able to, and also support from the global agency of Mercy Corps, we've been able to go through a process of fully automating our data analytics. So from the point of data collection using Comcare at each of those partners every quarter, it's all automated, so at the end we get a dashboard on the performance of each and every one of those institutions, aggregated by category, but also you can zoom in and look at the particular performance and the trend line over time. And that's within 6 days of actually collecting the data. So that's just been this game changer for us in terms of adaptive management and how we're able to use data. The other thing I'd like to highlight is around the team culture and the experience we've had here. So if you look at that general framework of adaptive management that's in the paper, one of the common enablers is collaborative teams. And what we've learned firsthand, in REPA is the degree to which that's true. So, as a large multi-sectoral program, we faced what many of these big programs face, which is this common challenge of component teams working in their silos. And we recognize that as a constraint and proactively set out to address that. through a process of deliberately identifying these opportunities for integration of interventions across our components. We now have multiple of those, more than 20 of these kind of fairly profound integration points. And so that's transformed the culture, in terms of how we work together. And what we found is the overall spirit of collaboration and, one team spirit within the team. But the point really here is that, I can really say confidently that these cross-component kind of collaborations and the integration of our interventions, they're now the major source of adaptive management in our interventions. And these are continuously evolving because of that collaboration. And also they're some of our most innovative and our transformative adaptations. They're not tweaks, they're often quite profound shifts in our interventions because of the ways we're combining the work that we're doing across different components. And then the final point I'll make, which maybe doesn't refer to what's in the paper, but I think it's interesting that we heard that Rebuild is going to be used by RC, hopefully as a kind of a great example that will influence other programs. Which is great, but I find that Mercy Corps, although a lot has improved over the years in adaptive management, we still don't have really kind of very well developed, standardized, ingrained processes around adaptive management. And it's interesting that, there was a big buzz around adaptive management around 2015 to 2018. And it's interesting, we're still kind of at the stage, 8 years later, when we're talking about these very positive examples, but it's not really very widespread yet, or it's not that robust yet. So maybe this is partly a question, I think, for the discussion is, why are we still at this stage? What more can we all do to really build these up in our respective organizations? Because as it is, we're mainly focusing on, we have to work it out for ourselves, as Brian and Reaper, by and large, we're working these things out for ourselves. Thank you, Helen.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think you're alone there, William. Great. Over to Mattia for his thoughts.
Thanks. Yeah, so I do really agree with the enablers and the constraints that have come through the work that you're doing already on Rebuild, and some of the things my colleagues have also spoken to. I wish to reiterate one point and then state 2 points on the enablers. So, one of the things that we learned was that when we started the journey with adaptive management, the programs teams were going ahead, and then they were leaving the support functions behind. And we also realized that it was not, the conversation in the organization at that time. So then the policies and the procedures and the systems were then kind of beginning to come against what we are trying to do. So we have to kind of then really reflect and try to get that conversation going in the organization, including at the top level. So it's really critical, and I think Priscilla was point on there around the culture the within the organization. The second thing that has been really useful for us is the issue of being deliberate about ensuring participation, not only of key actors within the project delivery framework, but also communities as well. And for us, really listening to communities through what we call the community voices was very helpful. And in fact, after like our second year, we saw the value in kind of doing the community voices before the strategy testing process, and then bringing community representatives to accompany their voices into the strategy testing session. Until the time that we kind of really review and validate the outcomes that have come through and kind of put them against the theories of change to see which of the strategies, the outcomes we are relating to. Then they will leave before we get into some of the technical conversations of analyzing that. So really important that we are de-eliticizing that process and encouraging that diversity of perspectives into the mix. And then I think, Priscilla, you kind of mentioned that in passing, the issue of staff capacity, really ensuring that you have staff, particularly at the frontline level, with hybrid identities and relationships within those communities, because it's then easy to kind of build trust that will really drive, local level mobilization and participation, and to kind of get them to that confidence level where they feel free to express themselves, and for building an adaptive mindset and behavior within teams and within the communities that we work with as well. And related to that, that all of us are kind of then maintaining a learning mindset where we are open to being challenged by communities and other project stakeholders, but where also we can challenge them in a constructive way to kind of then think a bit more beyond the things that we usually will know, into some of the things that may not sound very familiar or regular. In terms of constraints, again, look at those ones that some of those I've shared, and how some of the enablers, then can really, if you don't have them, they can also be constraining factors as well. One of the things that we found initially difficult was, encouraging disagreements, where people can disagree with one another. But when you have chiefs and other people and have young people in the room, or other committee people coming, and they're having to agree, to disagree, or to provide an alternative perspective to some of the thinking in the room, that was a bit difficult. But there is, if you really manage that well, there's a lot of value in that, because then it helps to kind of drive emergent thinking, as opposed to the sticking with things that are obvious, which would come out from some of the key people in the room sometimes. The other one was kind of dealing with complexity and time costs, because of the processes that we are kind of doing to do the adaptation. It was taking a lot of time. I understand it in itself a bit more complex. So kind of then try to demystify that, and then build those ones within the project circle itself. Like Community Voices doing our regular monitoring, outcome harvesting doing our regular monitoring, and things like that, so that those did not carry extra costs and time investments. And the last one from me is kind of balancing out, and I think it came out through your research as well, balancing out your focus on targets and learning and innovation, and how you ensure that you're not losing focus on any, but because all of them are important, but they're also required to kind of really optimize the level to which you can achieve your desired outcomes and changes I want to see. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mattia. Really insightful comments again. So over to Alice for the last word before we open to Q&A.
Great. Yeah, I think everything that people have said before me really resonates. And just, I think three points. One, to connect to what others have said about the workplace culture, patience is something that seems to be a key attribute or requirement of a manager of an adaptive program. Priscilla was talking about people can feel uncomfortable with adaptive management. It requires them to work in very different ways. So having that patience to guide people along that systems change is really important. And as Mattia was just speaking about, having that strong community link and community engagement is a real enabler. But I want to focus most of my comments here on this perennial issue around the funding picture, and really what do we need to see adaptive management. This kind of is my attempt to answer William's question that he put to us, which I think is really interesting, of why hasn't it taken a wider or stronger foothold in the sector now 8 years on. And I think it has something to do with this chicken and egg sort of gridlock between the funders and the donors on the one hand and the agencies. Because you hear the agencies say a lot that if you give us more flexible funding, here are the things we can do. What hears from some of the donors is where's the evidence for this, right? We don't see evidence that flexible funding is leading to these various attributes, including adaptive management, including more relevant and effective programming, higher satisfaction levels from communities. So there's something going on there in terms of providing and squaring the evidence that's needed. But then it also speaks to how these programs are funded and how organizations are set up around the funding that they receive. So several have mentioned, and I thought it was really great to highlight this in your paper about the fact that you can have a highly adaptive program on the programming side of things, very flexible funding from one donor, but that's being housed in an organization that still has very fixed approaches to procurement, to supply chain, to operations and compliance. And I think what a lot of donors have not fully grasped, which is an important point, is that until an organization, a humanitarian organization like IRC or Christian Aid or Mercy Corps gets an adequate amount of their funding to be flexible, they really don't have a strong financial incentive to change wholesale these operations and compliance mechanisms. I'm not quoting this from any of your organizations, but a different organization that had an adaptive management pilot was saying, in the end, this funding we got, this flexible funding we got, amounts to only 8% of our overall funding. So we're not going to change all of our procedures and processes and functions in the organization for 8% of the funding. I'm sure that there are really clever ways around that all of you have worked out and that you're doing and piloting in your approaches. But I think where this needs to go to overcome these barriers is that donors need to be more willing to accept a higher degree of uncertainty, to actually provide a larger percentage of flexible funding so that organizations can actually take these approaches to scale by changing wholesale approaches to programming, to operations, et cetera. And at the same time, it really places such a huge emphasis on the agencies that are doing this work to provide the evidence base on what difference it really makes to them and what they're able to achieve with and for local actors and communities.
Thank you, Alice. You've basically stolen my conclusion wrap-up. So the fantastic points. Thank you so much. We've received a number of really excellent questions in the chat. And thank you very much to the panelists who have already answered them. I'm going to pick up 3 to begin with. If anybody else has other things they would like to add, please do. We have about another 20 minutes left of Q&A. So firstly, to Nicole, I'd be really interested to hear about how Rebuild approached failure. So one of the questions was around whether you use certain criteria or processes to identify when to pause and scale down activities. Secondly, to Priscilla, would you be able to talk about what approach Rebuild took for identifying and planning reflection check-ins, in particular how you planned for those and how you structured them? And then finally, to all panelists, so maybe Nicole and Priscilla can pick this up, and then I'll turn to William and Alice. Do you feel that results-based management approaches are completely incompatible with adaptive programming, at least in the design phase? So firstly, Nicole, over to you.
Thanks, Helen, and thanks for the question. So in terms of how we thought about failure, so we did not have sort of hard and fast quantitative targets for something to sort of pass or fail. What we did establish at the outset of the program, and this was again something that we spent quite a bit of our design time on, was designing sort of a set of overarching criteria. So I would say the most influential of those is the need for interventions to be scalable. So this was really, as we, particularly in the strategy testing event, that was really kind of the key sort of point that we were sort of pressure testing the interventions against. So, did the intervention, first of all, look to be promising? Were we seeing positive results? And also then looking at whether those were going to be scalable, and whether it had the potential to be scalable. So yeah, I think it was less about thinking about failure in terms of sort of specific quantifiable targets, and more about sort of comparing against sort of overarching criteria and principles that we set at the very outset of the program. But Priscilla may want to also sort of comment on that as well. I pass over to her to answer the second question.
Thanks for that, Nicole. Yeah, and thanks for that great question. Let me talk about the approach that we used in terms of identifying the reflection check-ins. Yeah? So for us, we are constantly in communication as a team, including our partners and also our technical advisors. So it's not like a once-off event, but we are constantly in conversation. For example, as the program management team, we actually meet weekly to discuss what is working in Nairobi, what is working in Kampala. Can we have cross-learning between the two cities? We also come together as the Rebuild team monthly. At the end of each month, we, together with our partners, again, reflecting what is working, what is not, what do we need to course correct. And then within the IRSC family, we have an approach, what we call the program cycle meetings. I think that's also stated in the paper. We have different stages and different meetings that we go through. But the key important one that we really pay attention to as the Rebuild team is the program implementation meeting, where all of us meet quarterly to reflect on approaches that we're using, interventions that we're using, how do we want to improve for the quarter. All of this information being data-driven, but also feeding ultimately into the program testing event, or what we call the program learning conference, which is really around September timing. So for this year, our PLC program learning conference is actually going to be held on September the 19th, where we are coming together with the team, including the IKEA Foundation, to present what we have learned during this third year of our implementation, and then what adaptations we are proposing. And ultimately, that will inform how we want to plan for the year 4 program. So annually, we come around together, September timing for the reflection, and then that feeds into the October season, where we are actually putting together the annual work plan. So we do this actually every year. And then at the end of October, we submit what would be the following year's work plan and budget for consideration by the IKEA Foundation. We also have moments where we include our technical experts, what we call our technical advisory committee. They reflect with us, give us guidance in terms of some of the technical soundness of some of the practices and approaches that we are actually advancing. We also have the structure, what we call the steering committee for the program. This is a collection of colleagues that are implementing the program, CGD, IRC, the foundation is in there, the 2 local authorities are in there as well, where we come together and make decisions informed by what the implementing team would have put together. And then the steering committee makes decisions in terms of some of the proposals for course correction, adaptations, maybe dropping something. As Nicole said, yeah, we talk about learning in terms of maybe something that is not working. We talk about lessons in Rebuild. Failure is a strong word. Failure is maybe not being able to realize something, but we like to use the word learn. What did we learn? What is it that we can do to improve? What is it that we can share with colleagues that we walked this journey, we use this methodology, we use this approach, and ultimately we were not able to realize what we set out to do. Thanks. Back to you, Helen.
Thank you very much, Priscilla. That's incredibly useful. I now want to pass over to William and Mattia to answer the question, if they can, about results-based management, but also feel free to reflect on maybe how you and your organization approaches failure and scale down activities, and also the types of approaches that you use for those types of planning and reflection check-ins. So Mattia, you've got your video up, so I'll go to you first.
Okay, thanks. No, I would, on the first question, I would argue, at least from how we've learned so far, that, you know, resource-based management had its limitations, you know, and what adaptive management is done is to contribute to addressing some of those limitations. So, for example, in terms of understanding fully and embracing and responding to the politics of the context, and how organizations are able to kind of relate to constant flow of information within that context, and sometimes in ways that are irregular, and how that impacts the delivery of the organization of the project. And the second thing is that it kind of enables collection of outcomes, even those not funded by the project, and then working with the partners to then rationalize, what contributions have been made by the project to those outcomes, and to be able to determine through analysis whether there's a line of sight between what they are doing and that resulting outcome, as opposed to RBM, where you're focused on what you are set out to do, and you're only collecting information based on the indicators that have been set, against that particular result. And adaptive management creating more space, for really engagement and co-creation with communities, whereas in a result-based management, you're already set, you're kind of, your conversations are kind of limited as to how you're going to be able to achieve those results that have been defined and agreed. And our ability kind of create a lot of opportunities for learning and experimentation. And whereas adaptive management really creates those opportunities for learning and experimentation. And that takes me to the other question, where the research, the adaptive management approach is not totally risk averse. So it encourages innovation and creativity, and recognizes that there are things you will take on to do, and those things may not work, and recognizes the importance of learning to kind of then be able to get beyond that, instead of really spending time and continue to invest in something that may not be even working, but because that's what they have asked you to, you've set out to do in RBM, for example, then it doesn't kind of quite encourage you to change. So adaptive management really encourages that. What we've done as an organization is that we really want to be a bit more daring in terms of the things I want to do, and step into unfamiliar spaces in some of the approaches that we are putting forward for our programming, and monitoring and tracking how that is going, and where that is not happening or it's not giving us the outcomes that we want, being honest about that and learning as to why that did not work, and that becoming part of our ways of improving future programming. So we really encourage that failing forward, as some people call it, to kind of be able to fail forward and take that learning forward as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mattia. And finally, over to William. And I note the comment that Mead made in the Q&A. So if you have time and you'd like to share your screen, please feel free to do so.
Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah, so I think just building on what Mattia said on the results-based management, I mean, I think it really depends on the context and the programming, and also how that results-based management is defined. If it's defined around the results being kind of output level, then it can be hard to manage adaptively, where you have output level indicators or results you're trying to achieve. But where more commonly it's kind of impact outcome level, I would actually argue that adaptive management is, at least in kind of systems building programs, is more important, not less, where you really have to achieve those outcome level, household level targets. Because what we see is that adaptive management, it enables you to identify the successes and scale successes, and not pump resources into the things that are not working, where you're not going to achieve your results at the outcome level anyway. And so, yeah, so especially market systems development programs, I think for results-based programming, adaptive management is even more important. I think on the kind of approach to failure, it is difficult, and especially where it's natural that team members have attachment to the partners and the institutions, service providers, that they're the ones who've selected, and they really want them to be successful because they have this personal affinity and connection to these business owners. It's a long journey you go on, right, even to get to the point of a partnership. So for us, I think one of the key things is just setting expectation about failure right from the outset, acknowledging that like some high relatively or proportion of your businesses are not going to succeed, so that people don't feel bad when they don't. And also just taking away the kind of the connection between failure of the team member and a failure of business. And like Mattia said, failing forward. So where a business or partner or service provider is not working, understanding why that is, not keep on flogging that dead horse. If you really identify why and you're clear about the reasons, and there's a reason to leave them, then dropping them as a partner or changing the approach. So I'll stop this. Helen, shall I share my screen quickly then? Now?
Yeah, please feel free. We've got about 5 minutes left before I'll wrap up.
Yeah, I'll just do 1 minute. So let's see if we can just quickly. So I don't think it's rocket science. So you know, just to quickly show people, here we have kind of our components. Component 3 is around livestock systems and agricultural systems. Here you have the different, at the top right here, hopefully you can see, you have these different categories of partners. For example, PVP here is a private veterinary pharmacy. You can click on this and it tells you by region and in total, you know, how many PVPs are active. It tells you their sales each quarter, the customers each quarter, sales through their last mile agent, which we can refer to as these cows, for example. And so what this, and you can also then click on, you know, field, particularly for field team members, they can click on an individual business that they're responsible for. So, you know, Taraco, PVP, and they can look specifically at, you know, the performance. So here we see that, you know, they increased the number of their last mile agents, and then over time, there was a drop of 4 here. All of this just means that our team member is able to identify, understand what's happening with the business. They're able to, in their follow-up conversations, shine a light on that and dig into those particular areas. And we can also then, you know, if we see like stellar performance or bad performance, we can tailor our support to understand what's happening and also replicate approaches from successful businesses. We can dig in, learn what they're doing differently that's making them so successful, and share that with other businesses more easily. And then to take one example that's not the private sector, so for component 4, which is nutrition, we have these, government establishes these like basically community nutrition groups, the mother-to-mother support groups, which are community-led but established by government. And what we can see here, for example, you know, it helps us understand the context as well. So here we have the number of group conversations that were conducted and the number that were attended. And during the drought, we really used that to see what the participation rate per group, how that was affected. And we saw that in the drought affected areas, the participation rate really dropped. And that led the team to significantly adapt how we, and working with government, because they're the ones managing, how government manages and supports those groups through this nutrition awareness and discussion process. So yeah, it's very rich. And I mean, the thing that surprised me is just how field team members embraced it. You know, they can get it on their phone, they can look at it, they're keen every quarter to see the results, they can understand how their businesses are performing. I'll just leave it at that, thanks.
Thank you very much, William, especially for sharing that slide, and hopefully that answers your question, Need. But unfortunately, that's all we have time for today, but I'm sure that I speak on behalf of the panel when I say that it was a really fascinating discussion. I mean, personally, I heard a lot about risk, which is probably not that surprising. It's definitely difficult to prove the value of working adaptively versus not working adaptively. It's easier to hit narrow targets you've always hit for years and years and years, rather than trying to achieve bigger system change, especially when you know that that might fail. So as Alice mentioned in her last little intervention there, donors need to accept a higher degree of uncertainty, providing a higher amount of flexible funding to incentivize system change. But the onus is probably even more on implementers themselves. They need to provide the evidence of what difference that flexible funding really makes on the ground. And in doing so, obviously need to reduce the risk of experimentation and support staff in testing new approaches. And, you know, as Mattia said, being happy to fail and fail forward, thinking about approaching risk in a much more healthy way. So I'd definitely like to thank our panel for joining us today, Nicole for her presentation and remarks, and the teams at both CGD and IRC for their organization of our discussion. Especially thank you to all of you for joining us, and to everyone who put a question in the chat. I hope we answered them all, but obviously please do feel free to get in touch if you'd like to follow up with any additional questions or comments. As I mentioned in the chat, Nicole's slides and a recording of this presentation will be available online shortly, as is our paper. So please do look at all of those and share widely. And we very much hope to see you all at CGD's next event, which is actually taking place tomorrow from 10 till 11 Eastern Standard Time. It's a conversation with Jay Sharmbach, who's the US Treasury Undersecretary for International Affairs. He's going to be speaking about US policy priorities and ongoing IMF reform efforts. And it'll be followed by a discussion with Nancy Lee, who is one of our senior policy fellows and the director of our Sustainable Development Finance program. So many thanks again. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day and look forward to seeing you at a CGD event soon.